guys came to the school?
They forced us out of the car. They were following us. They were obsessed.
When ICE decided to take its operations to the front of an elementary school, millions demanded answers. But what officials didn't expect was the backlash, especially from the Chicago state government. And word is that the government's plans for ICE will stop their operations indefinitely. The viral arrest that divided America. In the heart of Chicago, on a seemingly ordinary October day in 2025, a video began circulating across social media that would ignite one of the most heated debates about immigration enforcement, civil liberties, and federal power in recent American history. What appeared to be a routine federal operation quickly transformed into a national flashpoint, exposing deep fractures in how Americans view immigration policy, law enforcement authority, and the very nature of sanctuary cities. The footage was raw, unfiltered, and deeply unsettling. It showed federal agents, later identified as U.S. Border Patrol officers operating under the Department of Homeland Security, surrounding a locked blue SUV parked near Chicago World Language Academy, an elementary school on the city's west side. The scene that unfolded would be viewed millions of times, shared across countless platforms, and debated in living rooms, congressional hearings, and newsrooms across the nation. The incident occurred on October 8, 2025, when federal agents confronted two women in their vehicle near the school. A bystander, witnessing the escalating confrontation, began recording on their phone. The video captures a tense exchange as agents surround the SUV, their presence both overwhelming and methodical. You can hear the confusion and fear in the voices as people ask questions that would echo across the country.
Wait, you guys came to the school to do this?
Do you have a warrant? They haven't asked for a warrant. My name is Jocelyn from Cicero. They don't have a warrant.
The woman being detained, identifying herself as Jocelyn from Cicero, repeatedly emphasized crucial details that would become central to the controversy.
And they didn't ask for one. They forcefully opened the door of the truck. It was locked. It was locked.
You're going to record this. Don't get it closer from me, right? Like, cool. Just stay back, please. She's being arrested.
This single statement would fuel weeks of legal debates, protests, and political maneuvering. The chaos of the moment is palpable in the recording.
Yeah, but you guys came to the school?
Out of the car. They forced us out of the car. They were following us. They were obsessed.
The distress in the voices, the confusion among bystanders, and the forceful nature of the arrest created a visceral reaction among viewers who would watch and share the video millions of times over the coming days and weeks. As the situation escalates in the video, you can hear the emotional toll on everyone present.
Whoa.
My sister, help me! Help me!
Can you step back, please? You're okay.
I know I'm okay, but I'm worried about other people.
The concern isn't just for the individuals being detained, it extends to the broader community, to the other people who might be affected, to the very fabric of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Perhaps most tellingly, the confusion among witnesses about what was actually happening underscores how quickly a law enforcement action can become a community crisis.
Oh no. They were coming to get their kid? They don't have to answer my question? Like what? Were they coming to get a child? I'm just a little bit confused.
This confusion about who these women were, what they were doing near the school, whether they were parents picking up children, would become emblematic of the larger confusion and conflict surrounding immigration enforcement in America. But who were these women, and why were they being detained in such a dramatic fashion? According to subsequent investigations and official statements from DHS, the two individuals were sisters, both protected under DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, a program that shields certain undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children from deportation. This fact alone would add layers of complexity to an already contentious situation, raising questions about whether legal protections were being respected or violated. The Department of Homeland Security's version of events painted a dramatically different picture from what many viewers saw in the viral video. Federal officials claimed the women were not random targets or innocent bystanders caught in an immigration sweep. Instead, DHS characterized them as agitators who had been stalking an ICE vehicle and trying to impede another targeted operation opposition by following agents recklessly through traffic, using megaphones and whistles to harass them, and then abruptly stopping near the school. This characterization of the women as active opponents of ICE operations rather than passive victims fundamentally changed the narrative, at least in the eyes of federal authorities and their supporters. The government's account suggested a calculated pattern of interference. The sisters had allegedly followed federal agents using megaphones and whistles, creating a spectacle and potentially compromising operational security. When agents attempted to address this interference, according to DHS, the women refused to exit their vehicle, leading to the forceful removal captured on video. Yet even with this official explanation, fundamental questions remained unanswered. If the women were indeed interfering with federal operations, why weren't they charged with any crimes? No federal charges were immediately filed against either woman, and both were released after agents verified their DACA status. This release, occurring within hours of the arrest, suggested that the situation may not have been as clear-cut as either side claimed. The location of the arrest added another explosive element to the controversy. The fact that this confrontation occurred near an elementary school during school hours, when parents and children were nearby, transformed what might have been a routine enforcement action into something far more troubling for many observers. Schools had become increasingly sensitive zones in the immigration debate, with educators and parents expressing deep concern about the psychological impact on children who witness such operations. Teachers in Chicago had begun adapting their lesson plans to address the fears and anxieties of students in immigrant communities. Know Your Rights materials were being distributed. Indoor recess was becoming more common when ICE activity was reported nearby. The arrest video seemed to validate every fear that parents and educators had been harboring about federal enforcement, reaching into spaces that had traditionally been considered sanctuaries for children. Posts on X from users like @DJTIMM attempted to provide context, pointing out visible Chicago police involvement and arguing it was a felony arrest unrelated to immigration. These counter-narratives struggled to gain the same traction as the initial emotional responses, a common pattern in how information spreads in our current media landscape, where the first impression often leaves the deepest mark. The controversy was further complicated by broader developments in Chicago's immigration enforcement landscape. This incident occurred during Operation Midway Blitz, a large-scale federal operation that had been unfolding in the Chicago area since September 2025. Named in honor of Katie Abraham, who had been killed by an undocumented immigrant driver, the operation was explicitly designed to target what the Department of Homeland Security called criminal illegal aliens in sanctuary jurisdictions. By the time of this October arrest, Operation Midway Blitz had already resulted in over 800 arrests, including individuals with convictions for serious crimes. The operation had seen dramatic enforcement actions, including a raid just days earlier where nearly 300 agents, some rappelling from Black Hawk helicopters, descended on a South Shore apartment building, arresting dozens of people suspected of ties to the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. Advocacy groups like the Sidewalk School confirmed through Instagram posts that the detained women were indeed DACA recipients and that they had been released, but this confirmation did little to quell the outrage. For many, the fact that protected individuals could be detained, forcefully removed from their vehicle, and held, even temporarily, represented a fundamental violation of their rights and the protections they had been promised. The incident crystallized fears that had been building in immigrant communities across Chicago for weeks. Reports of ICE activity had been surging throughout the fall of 2025, prompting rapid community response efforts. In neighborhoods like Lincoln Square, community members had established safeguard systems for schools and neighbors. The network of support and vigilance that immigrant communities were building spoke to a deep-seated fear that went far beyond individual arrests. The battle lines are drawn. The arrest video arrived at a moment when Chicago had already become ground zero for one of the most significant confrontations between federal immigration authorities and local government in modern American history. What had begun as a targeted enforcement operation had evolved into something far more expansive and controversial, a full-scale federal intervention that Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker characterized as nothing less than an assault on their city and state. Mayor Brandon Johnson's response to the escalating federal presence was swift and uncompromising. On October 6, 2025, he signed an executive order establishing what he termed ICE free zones throughout the city. The order was sweeping in its scope and explicit in its intent. It prohibited federal immigration agents from using city-owned or controlled properties, including parking lots, parks, schools, and libraries, for civil immigration enforcement activities. Standing before cameras, flanked by community leaders and elected officials, Johnson delivered a statement that captured the anger and defiance felt by many Chicagoans. His words resonated resonated with parents who had watched the viral arrest video, who had heard stories of children witnessing aggressive federal operations, who were grappling with how to explain to their children why armed agents were operating near their schools. But the mayor's executive order went beyond simply prohibiting federal use of city property. It mandated that city departments identify potential sites, install clear signage, and implement physical barriers where feasible. The signs would read, "This property is owned and/or controlled by the City of Chicago. It may not be used for civil immigration enforcement, including as a staging area, processing location, operations base." The order even extended protections to private property owners, tenants, and businesses, offering free signage and know your rights materials to those who wanted to deny access to agents without warrants. Yet, the most explosive allegations from Mayor Johnson centered not on where ICE was operating, but on how they were conducting themselves.
ICE agents are detaining elected officials, tear gassing protesters, children, and Chicago police officers, and abusing Chicago residents.
These were not minor complaints about paperwork or procedures. These were allegations of chemical weapons being deployed against American citizens, including children and law enforcement officers who were ostensibly on the same side. The accusation that ICE had tear-gassed Chicago police officers would become one of the most contentious claims in the entire controversy. If true, it represented an unprecedented escalation, federal agents using force against local police. The implications were staggering. It suggested either a catastrophic breakdown in communication and coordination, or a deliberate decision by federal authorities to treat even local law enforcement as obstacles to be overcome rather than partners in maintaining public safety. The incident in question occurred during protests outside the Broadview ICE facility, where demonstrations had been ongoing for weeks. Federal agents, facing crowds blocking access to buses transporting detainees, deployed chemical irritants to disperse the protesters. Approximately 27 Chicago police officers who were on scene, ostensibly to maintain order and ensure public safety, were exposed to the tear gas. Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling confirmed that his department had opened 3 criminal investigations into ICE following the exposure of officers to tear gas. This wasn't just an internal matter or an administrative complaint. These were criminal investigations, suggesting that local authorities believed federal agents may have committed crimes against Chicago's own police force. The allegations of tear gas use extended beyond police officers to civilians, including children. In Logan Square, a teacher at Funston Elementary School witnessed ICE agents deploying tear gas canisters near the school during a confrontation with bystanders. Students who had been outside for recess were rushed indoors, and the school cancelled outdoor activities for the day. Activists who arrived on scene described what they saw as indiscriminate violence, chemical agents deployed without regard for who might be affected, including children whose schools happened to be in the vicinity of ICE operations. The clashes at the Broadview ICE facility had become particularly intense, with weekly protests that drew hundreds of demonstrators. Videos circulating on social media showed agents using not just tear gas, but pepper balls, rubber bullets, and physical force against protesters. A Presbyterian minister was shot in the head with a pepper ball while he was praying, captured on video as he stood with his hands clasped in front of him. The footage shows him staggering from the impact, then getting back to his feet, even as more shots can be heard in the background. Perhaps most troubling for press freedom advocates, federal agents were accused of targeting journalists covering the protests. CBS Chicago correspondent Asal Rezai suffered chemical burns severe enough to require medical attention after agents fired pepper balls at her car, despite there being no protesters in her immediate vicinity. A WGN-TV producer was detained for hours on October 10th, held by agents in what news organizations characterized as an attempt to intimidate the press. These incidents prompted news groups to file lawsuits against ICE and DHS, alleging excessive force and First Amendment violations. A federal judge responded by issuing a temporary restraining order barring ICE from using tear gas or pepper spray against reporters at Broadview, citing First Amendment concerns. The ruling was narrow but significant. It acknowledged that federal agents had crossed a line in how they were treating members of the press. The Department of Homeland Security's response to these allegations was emphatic and unapologetic. DHS officials labeled the protesters domestic terrorists and defended the use of force as defensive measures against violent attacks. According to DHS, agents faced a 1,000% surge in assaults during Operation Midway Blitz, including vehicle rammings and what they characterized as orchestrated ambushes. The agency pointed to specific incidents to justify their heightened posture. On October 2nd, 2025, 2 separate vehicle attacks on ICE officers. On October 4th, a woman named Marimar Martinez, armed with a semi-automatic weapon and allegedly involved in doxing federal agents, was shot 5 times after what federal authorities claimed was an attempt to ram a Border Patrol vehicle. DHS even claimed that that cartels had placed bounties ranging from $5,000 to $50,000 on federal agents, turning the streets of Chicago into what they characterized as a war zone. But even the shooting of Marimar Martinez revealed the deep contested nature of events in Chicago. Her lawyer presented body cam footage that he claimed showed the federal agent taunting her with the words, "Do something, B," before turning into her vehicle and opening fire. Martinez, a 30-year-old U.S. citizen with no prior criminal record and a valid firearm license, was now facing federal charges for assault and attempted murder. A judge denied pretrial detention, citing her clean record and raising questions about whether the shooting was justified or an escalation provoked by the agent himself. The most controversial federal operation came on September 30th, 2025, when nearly 300 federal agents conducted a raid on a South Shore apartment building. The operation involved agents rappelling from Black Hawk helicopters onto the building's rooftop, a dramatic show of force more commonly associated with military operations in war zones than domestic law enforcement in American cities. DHS justified the raid as targeting members of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang that federal authorities had designated as a terrorist organization. The operation resulted in 37 arrests, but the tactics drew immediate criticism. Residents described masked agents kicking in doors at 1 a.m., zip-tying people, including children, and separating families. Some U.S. citizens were temporarily detained as agents cleared the building, a practice that federal officials defended as necessary for safety, but that critics viewed as a violation of constitutional rights. A federal judge later ruled that 22 warrantless arrests during Operation Midway Blitz violated a 2022 consent decree ordering the government to reimburse detained individuals and potentially releasing hundreds from custody. The ruling was a significant legal setback for federal authorities, suggesting that in their zeal to enforce immigration law, they had trampled on constitutional protections. Against this backdrop of military-style raids, chemical weapons, and legal challenges, Mayor Johnson's accusation that ICE had tear-gassed police officers took on new significance. In a video that went viral, the mayor stated emphatically that ICE tear-gassed our police and called for a full investigation. He reiterated this demand in a TikTok video, making clear that this wasn't a casual allegation but a formal complaint that he expected to be taken seriously. The federal government's response was to deny that any improper use of force had occurred and to accuse local officials of creating an environment that endangered federal agents. An anonymous federal agent told Fox News that Chicago's ICE-free zones were actually endangering operations by forcing agents to stage in public areas, making them more vulnerable to tracking and attacks by protesters who monitored their movements through social media. As these battles intensified on the streets of Chicago, they were mirrored in courtrooms and in the halls of power. Governor Pritzker filed a lawsuit to block the deployment of National Guard troops that President Trump had ordered to protect federal agents, calling it an unconstitutional invasion. On October 9th, U.S. District Judge April Perry issued a 14-day block on the deployment of 500 National Guard troops from Illinois and Texas, citing violations of the Posse Comitatus Act and the 10th Amendment. The president responded by calling for Pritzker and Johnson to be arrested for failing to protect federal agents. The rhetoric on both sides had reached a fever pitch. President Trump posted on social media,
"Chicago mayor should be in jail for failing to protect ICE officers. Governor Pritzker also."
Meanwhile, Pritzker was telling the Chicago Tribune that Trump was suffering dementia and had something stuck in his head that he couldn't get out. What had begun with a video of two women being arrested near a school had escalated into a constitutional crisis, with federal and local authorities at loggerheads, courts issuing conflicting rulings, and communities caught in the middle. The question was no longer just about immigration enforcement. It was about the nature of federal power, the rights of states and cities to resist that power, and whether American democracy could withstand the strain of such fundamental disagreements about who gets to make the rules. The larger story and what it means. To truly understand how a single arrest video could spark such an intense national controversy, we must zoom out and examine the broader context of what was happening in Chicago in the fall of 2025. The viral footage of the two DACA recipients being forcefully removed from their SUV was not an isolated incident. It was one piece of a much larger puzzle, a dramatic escalation in federal immigration enforcement that had been building for months and was reshaping the landscape of immigrant communities across America. Operation Midway Blitz, launched on September 8, 2025, represented the Trump administration's most aggressive push yet to enforce immigration law in so-called sanctuary cities. Named in honor of Katie Abraham, who had been killed by an undocumented immigrant driver in Illinois, the operation was explicitly framed as a response to what federal authorities characterized as sanctuary policies that attracted and protected dangerous criminals. By early October, the operation had resulted in over 1,000 arrests, with DHS emphasizing that those detained included murderers, rapists, activists, gang members, and other violent offenders. The agency released detailed profiles of arrestees: Eric Rios, a Mexican MS-13 member with DUI and property damage convictions; Gabriel J. Valle Galvez, a Latin king with assault and DUI records; Stefan Chev, an Austrian charged with murder and child rape. These profiles were designed to justify the aggressive tactics and to counter the narrative that federal agents were simply terrorizing innocent immigrant communities, but critics pointed to data that complicated this narrative. Fact-checkers and immigrant rights groups noted that 60% of ICE detainees in Illinois had no criminal convictions of any kind, with many arrested for minor infractions like traffic violations. A motion filed by the National Immigrant Justice Center highlighted cases of individuals arrested outside court hearings for unrelated matters, suggesting that the operation was sweeping up anyone it could find, not just the worst of the worst, as claimed. The operation's tactics had evolved from traditional enforcement to something that looked increasingly like military operations. The September 30th raid on the South Shore apartment building involved not just the 300 agents and Black Hawk helicopters, but also the use of flashbang grenades, military-style entry techniques, and tactics that residents and advocates described as terrorizing. Eyewitnesses described children screaming, families being separated, and people being zip-tied and held for hours before agents determined their immigration status. Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bovino defended these tactics forcefully. When asked about critics who compared federal operations to Gestapo tactics, he responded,
"How about you live in the apartment next door to Tren de Aragua members that are trafficking in prostitution, guns, drugs, and taking advantage of American citizens in a violent way? Why don't you live next to them and then see how much of a Gestapo or a Nazi we are?"
The reference to Tren de Aragua was crucial to understanding the federal government's justification for its aggressive approach. Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang that originated in the country's prison system, had been designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the Trump administration in early 2025. The gang had been linked to human trafficking, drug distribution, extortion, and violent crimes in multiple U.S. states, and federal authorities claimed it was using the Venezuelan migration crisis to establish a foothold in American cities. Intelligence reports suggested that TDA had given a green light for attacks on law enforcement in Denver, raising concerns about organized violence against police. In Chicago, authorities had arrested dozens of suspected TDA members, including some linked to murders and kidnappings. The South Shore apartment building that was raided had been the site of a murder in June 2025, allegedly carried out by TDA members. However, experts and investigative journalists raised questions about whether the TDA threat was being exaggerated for political purposes. NPR reported that TDA's U.S. presence was smaller than federal officials say, with confirmed gang members numbering in the dozens rather than the hundreds or thousands suggested by some administration officials. Insight Crime, an organization specializing in organized crime research, described TDA's U.S. operations as opportunistic rather than strategic, suggesting that many crimes attributed to the gang were actually committed by unaffiliated individuals who might be wearing similar tattoos or clothing. Critics also pointed out that some of the identification methods used to designate someone as a TDA member were questionable at best. Tattoos of crowns, trains, or Michael Jordan were being used as indicators, but these symbols were common in Venezuelan culture and didn't necessarily signify gang membership. The concern was that legitimate asylum seekers and migrants who had nothing to do with criminal activity were being swept up in operations targeting the gang, guilty by association or by the mere fact of being Venezuelan. The impact on Chicago's immigrant communities was profound and far-reaching. School enrollment of English learners dropped by 2.7% as families either left the area or kept children home out of fear. Businesses in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods like Little Village and Pilsen reported significant declines in activity as people became afraid to go out in public. Hotlines operated by groups like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights were receiving over 1,000 calls per day, with panicked families reporting ICE sightings and seeking guidance on what to do if agents came to their doors. Teachers across Chicago adapted their lesson plans to include Know Your Rights information, teaching students as young as elementary age what to do if ICE agents approached them or their families. Some educators advocated for e-learning days when ICE activity was reported in their neighborhoods, prioritizing children's sense of safety over attendance requirements. The psychological toll on children who witnessed these operations, or even just heard about them from classmates, was a growing concern among mental health professionals and educators. Rapid response networks expanded from 10 to over 30 organizations, with volunteers documenting incidents, providing legal resources, officers and mobilizing community support when ICE operations were reported. These networks represented a grassroots resistance to federal enforcement, a parallel infrastructure designed to protect community members when they felt local government couldn't or wouldn't do enough. The legal battles surrounding these operations revealed deep constitutional questions about the limits of federal power and the rights of states and cities to resist. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's lawsuit against the National Guard deployment cited the Posse Comitatus Act, an 1878 law that restricts the use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. The judge's temporary block on the deployment suggested that the courts were willing to push back against what they saw as executive overreach. As the debate raged on, one thing became clear. The viral arrest video was not an ending, but a beginning, the opening salvo in what promised to be a long and bitter struggle over immigration enforcement, federal power, and the soul of American democracy. The resolution of that struggle would shape not just the lives of immigrants and their families, but the character of the nation itself, determining whether America would live up to its stated ideals or whether those ideals would be sacrificed in the name of security and order. The questions raised by that October day near Chicago World Language Academy would echo through courtrooms and legislative chambers, through community meetings and family dinner tables, through social media feeds and cable news debates for years to come. And at the center of it all would remain that haunting image: two women in a locked SUV, surrounded by federal agents, pulled forcibly from their vehicle as bystanders recorded and questioned and wondered what country they were living in. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.